This series is made possible by the generous donation of Stifel Financial and viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Where Do We Go From Here, a series that explores issues that matter locally and sometimes regionally, nationally, and around the world. Lou Sitzer, our producer, and all of us here involved have a goal to bring you the best information we can from informed local experts and leaders in the community on the subjects that we cover. And why are we doing this? To help all of us decide where do we go from here and how might we get there. I'm your host, Debbie Gibbs, and I'm an environmentalist and a farmer. And at the end of the show, I will give you more information on how to watch past episodes as well as how you might contribute to this series. But for now, let's begin. The series today is going to be addressing climate change, and that's certainly a global issue that affects us all here locally. And I'm really excited to have with me Reed Hamilton, who is a local farmer and environmentalist also. And he's going to talk about regenerative agriculture and what it is and why it's important in terms of climate change. Reed is the owner of Grass Valley Grains. He's been a farmer for many, many years. And he's also a member of the Nevada County Climate Change Coalition. And I'm pleased to say that I advise Nevada County Grown, and we recently did the latest food and farm guide. And if you want to hear more about Reed's projects, there's an article on regenerative agriculture, and he is featured in it. So thank you so much, Reed, for coming. And I understand you started out in Illinois. So how did you get to California?
Well, I grew up on a typical Illinois farm. We had hogs and corn, soybeans, wheat, oats, dairy cows early. And after I finished college, I went back to the farm for a few years, but then I moved to California in 1973 and got involved in alternative education and carpentry and other things, and so I moved to Nevada County in 1983 and was doing those other things to make a living and support my family. And then in 2007, I felt the desire to start back into farming again, and so I was offered 54 acres on my friend Jim Muck's place in Wheatland, which was suitable for grain growing, which was something I was already familiar with. I didn't want to start in on a project that the learning curve was going to be too steep. So that's how I came to farming here.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, fascinating. So that usually somebody starts with vegetables and you start with grains. That was because of your Illinois exposure?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, that's intriguing. To me, it's a tomato plant that I would start with. So regenerative agriculture. It's a term that's sort of been introduced recently. I guess by way of a preview. I think back through Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth in 2006, and that's where we began to. Climate change entered the mainstream vocabulary. And what I'm noticing now, and you and I have talked about this, is scientists are now using a new term. They're using the term anthropogenic climate disruption, ACD, which is the term I'll use, which actually, in my vernacular, means man-made climate chaos. So could you explain to us a little bit what that means? I know you follow this science closely, and you were well-versed on some of the specifics of what this means.
Well, anthropogenic just means that this is the first era in which human beings have the greatest influence on our climate and biosphere, as opposed to the forest and the animals and so on. Now we dominate. What we've done since the start of the industrial age has changed the world entirely. And at that time there were 227 parts per million of CO2, and now it's over 400. And we've kind of locked in a 1.6 Fahrenheit temperature rise worldwide, which will have very unpredictable and, as you said, chaotic effects on the world and on agriculture in particular.
Okay, and agriculture is something we're concerned about, and it's not. I think we're seeing the reports that ACD might mean perhaps cruising for another Dust Bowl like we had in the 1930s. Will it be that severe, or is it something less than that, or something different than that?
Well, it could be some of that. It could be a lot of different things. We expect from the modeling that there will be much more variability year to year. Weather events will be more extreme with heavier rainfall. It will be warmer, so in California, less snow will fall in the mountains and more rain, which means that we can't use that as a reservoir for irrigation during the summer. Our droughts will be hotter and more frequent. Wildfires are more likely to be more severe and widespread. In other parts of the country, flooding and cold temperatures in the growing season could severely affect production there. So it's a combination of all of the above.
Okay, and as a farmer, yeah, I mean that's the challenge always is the weather more than anything else, and the extremes, and trying to. And I know you'll talk about that later. Some of
Right.
the challenges that you've had in your own experience. You know, one of the things that in my reading that I've seen is our current farming methods are really depleting the way agriculture and depleting the soil that we have, and some of the estimates are that we have another 60 harvests left. That's all that's left with the topsoil unless we revise the way we actually farm. So that kind of brings us to the regenerative agriculture arena, and the fact that some people believe and some scientists believe that this might, not only do we need to do something to stop the release of fossil fuels because of agriculture, but that agriculture can capture carbon, that this might be a solution instead of a problem. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, the basis of this thinking and research is that we now know, after lots of study in the last 10 years particularly, that the microbial life in the soil is not only the source of fertility, resistance to disease, water storage, and carbon capture. So conventional agriculture particularly disrupts that by tilling the soil, and every time we do that, we disrupt that community, and by adding chemicals in the way of pesticides and herbicides, which also kill off some of the beneficial things in the soil, and by adding nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which in the process of making those chemicals too, and that tilling, we're also burning lots of petroleum and putting more carbon dioxide in the air.
Okay, so all around, all sorts of issues that arise that hopefully we might be able to mitigate with a different way of doing
Right.
agriculture. So just to sort of sum up what Reed is talking about, we have a very short DVD clip called The Soil Story, which is produced by Kiss the Ground, which is a local group in Los Angeles, which gives you a very simple idea of what Reed and I are talking about in terms of the opportunity to sequester carbon and what that means in terms of improving the soil that we have to do better agriculture and to help with the whole climate disruption issue. So if we could, we're going to go to that short video and show that to you, and then we'll come back and talk some more about what we've just seen.
If you're like most people, you're probably feeling a little hopeless about climate change and the damage we've done to our planet. Well, now there's a new way to look at climate change and how to deal with it that might just turn that hopelessness into hope. Climate change, as we know, is all about too much carbon in our atmosphere. But carbon is not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it, even us. The problem and the solution are simply a matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants first appeared on land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance between these pools, a balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, that would be us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool, which was pretty much a timeout zone for carbon. We've been burning it for energy, putting into play, and disrupting that balance. The way we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. The oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, throwing off the ocean's balance, resulting in ocean acidification and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. So in order to save life as we know it, of course we need to stop burning fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put this excess carbon to get the cycle back in balance? The good news is that the answer is literally right under our feet. It's the soil. Plants, using sunlight and water, naturally perform photosynthesis. They pull carbon in from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of these sugars down through the roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build healthy soil. Voila, carbon moved. The plants pump it in and the soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost can help regenerate healthy soil, setting up an ongoing feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. Together with other regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees and cover crops, and planned grazing, we can build and retain billions of tons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. Unlike more carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil, which is nutrient-rich and full of life and holds way more water. This means more nutritious food and crops that are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for farmers, families, and everyone who eats. Remember this, the way we grow our food, fiber, and fuel either puts carbon up into our atmosphere or pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of our soils, and the health of our planet are one and the same.
And we're back. Okay, that was very, very cleverly done, and I think enjoyable. One of the things that we talked about is a lot of people have the impression that organic is really the gold standard, that if you buy organic produce, that you're doing your part, that measures have been used that can assure you that that's agriculture that's useful and safe and good for the environment. But it has some limitations. Could you tell me what you think about that?
Well, organic is definitely an improvement. For one thing, you're not putting all those chemicals and artificial fertilizers in the soil and disrupting that microbial community. The limitation is that, especially in large-scale organic agriculture, a lot of times they're leaving the ground bare, and one of the fundamental principles of regenerative agriculture is you always have something growing, because the interaction of plants, especially a variety of plants, with the microbial life in the soil is what captures carbon and generates humus and organic matter in the soil, which makes the plants healthier, and so on and so on. So organic is good in that respect, and most local farmers here, smaller farmers, are using cover crops, which are a vital part of that process. But they also tend to till up the soil before they put in a crop. They incorporate that cover crop, which generates a quick reaction between the soil microbes and that available organic matter, and so it gives a big boost to the plants. But then you've got to start over again, rebuilding that microbial community. So I'm not going to presume to tell vegetable growers how they're going to do this, nor am I going to pretend that this is a simple process. It's really a learning process about your soil, your microclimate, your particular situation, the crops you're growing, and how they're all going to interact with these cover crops and so on. But where it needs to go is to some kind of limited or no tillage. And I know Singing Frog Farm has been mentioned as a place that is using no-till with vegetables. So it does seem to be possible, and that's where organic needs to go.
Okay, yeah, they are the new model, and I know there are some local farmers that are experimenting with this, and the article again in the Farm Guide talks about that. And you're right. I mean, I use the term "you practice farming" because it is not
Right.
a science only. I mean, there's the whole microclimate in every little plot of land.
Right,
So
right.
yeah, I'm with you there. But nonetheless, I mean, it does make sense that the less Mother Nature generally does things right. I mean, she's pretty successful, and if you can disturb her as little as possible, that's helpful, and probably you'll get long-term success that way. In terms of the actual carbon capture, if we use regenerative agriculture, what would you say would be some of the estimates from the reading that you've done?
Well, there is a scientist at Ohio State who has said that if regenerative techniques were used on just the desertified and degraded lands in the world, that about 30% of the emissions that we now have would be offset. And Rodale Institute is a little more optimistic. They think that 50% of current emissions could be offset by using regenerative ag and capturing carbon in the soil.
Wow, so almost half of our problem.
Could be.
Okay.
That may be optimistic, but the figures are up there.
Okay, that's really encouraging. Again, regenerative farming, I sort of think of like permaculture. I mean, it is. Do you think that's a good comparison? Are the two the concepts the same? Permaculture has been around a while, and I know there are a lot of permaculture farmers. You associate it more with home gardeners probably than you do with production farmers. So that's why I ask. I mean, you're more accustomed to seeing, okay, in production, if you're going to make a living doing this, will a permacultural approach or...
Well, certainly the basis for permaculture is the same as with regenerative agriculture, because you have a variety of plants in the permaculture setting that are interacting with each other and with that microbial community. So that is the same. The scale may be different, although I imagine that the permaculture style could be expanded to much larger acreage, and we may see that in terms of silvopasture,
Okay.
Or multi-species crop production interplanted and things like that.
Could you explain a little bit more what silvopasture is?
Silvopasture is a practice where animals are grazed underneath a tree crop, whether it's for lumber, fruit, nuts, or whatever, and also are gaining that forage. So it's kind of an open forest setting, and the interaction between the animals and their manure and their effect on the plants on the ground with those trees provides multiple benefits, not only in having the animals for production, but also the trees producing some kind of crop.
Interesting. Because I think of our foothill arena, and I know my pasture, I have oak trees in there, so I sort of have a silvo pasture, and I do notice that many times the grass that grows underneath those oak trees is definitely preferred by my animals to the stuff that's out there in the bleaching sun. So that makes some sense to me. So you're an ambitious guy. I mean, I want folks to hear what you went through in terms of a recent USDA grant you got to actually explore this from a very scientific standpoint. And you're collecting the data. You've got grant funds. You're working with USDA and going to be collecting data, which really gives more definitive results than, again, the person who practices farming and just sort of sees what works. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Well, the background is that I started farming on this land in Wheatland in 2007, and it was at that time land that had been fallow for 40 years. So it was grassland, non-native species, but it had been sitting there and just those microbes working away. So I did what I was used to doing, and I tilled it all up and I planted it to crops, and that worked pretty well for a number of years. But the weed pressure started to get worse and worse because there was a whole bank of weed seeds in that soil. So every time I turned it over, more of them grew, and then they produced seed, and so it got worse and worse. And without any way to cultivate for those weeds, it started to really impact the cost of cleaning the grain crop. So then we got into the drought, and I had a couple of years where I had virtually no crop. And then we had winter before this past one where it rained way through the winter and it drowned out most of what I had. So I had gotten to the point where it was clear that it was just not profitable or practical to proceed the way that I had been. And I'd been reading about regenerative agriculture and soil health for a long time, and I became familiar with the Natural Resources Conservation Service Conservation Stewardship Program, and consulted with their office in Yuba City and applied for grants from them and from the EQIP program, EQIP, for the cost of cover crop seed. So we developed a conservation plan that included how I would rotate crops and the type of cover crops I would use and so on. And they came out and we did soil measurements for a baseline with CO2 emissions, soil bulk density, which is how friable it is, and worm count, water infiltration, and soil temperatures. And so every year they come out about the same time of year and do those measurements over again. And in addition, then I do regular fertility testing. And so I hope that by the end of this 5-year contract, we'll have some real measurable results on how this has worked. And part of my program is that I am planning it no-till. So I hired somebody with a no-till drill, which is a big, heavy, complicated, expensive piece of machinery. And we plant right through the existing old plant residue. No tilling, no disturbing it. And so we're hoping to build not only fertility, but resilience in that soil so that I retain moisture in the dry times, and the organic matter will help prevent waterlogging in the wet times.
Okay, so then this is the cover crop is never tilled in, so it's just cut off.
It's just cut off
and left to. And I think I heard a term like crimping or something where it actually isn't. It's just rolled over.
Well, I'm actually not doing that because I share the land with a cattle raiser. We agreed that he would use his cattle to terminate that cover crop and incorporate it in the soil by doing managed grazing.
Okay, so they do the
Yeah,
they do the harvesting of the cover crop, and then you
which
get
also saves me time and money.
That's right. Love it when animals are put to work in a useful way and they enjoy themselves at the same time. Obviously, you've traveled quite a path in order to get where you're at. What could you tell us all some of the risks that farmers face? I mean, I think, it sounds simple, let the animals in, chew it down, and then I plant. I know it's not that simple, that there are a lot of things you need, considerations in terms of making a living doing this. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, my own experience is sort of demonstrative of those challenges. Drought, too much rain. I haven't had too many insect problems, but with vegetable growers, that's a major issue, and diseases are a major issue for everyone. And then marketability, what you can get for it, what your costs of processing are, costs of transportation, your marketing opportunities. Are you selling in a farmer's market? Are you selling wholesale? Can you get contracts? You know, are you growing the same things that everybody else is growing, so you can't really generate enough money? And of course, for young starting farmers, there is a whole investment in infrastructure and reconditioning land, mostly in Nevada County, where you're not starting with existing cropland. So a whole range of things, and I think it's extremely challenging for small farmers to make it.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. A couple of the other farmers that are in the article talk about what drew them to regenerative agriculture was the lack of infrastructure. That for the most part, they are small farmers. You know, it's just one or two of them that are doing the work. They're not investing in tractors or big machinery. They're using human labor, and sometimes, you know, some hired labor. And I think Singing Frogs may also use that approach, where they really minimize any. So that's the good news. You don't invest, you know, and the type of things that many farmers have to go in debt for, their tractors, their all those sorts of things. But you sure get your exercise. For a grain farmer, I don't know whether that's even possible.
No, that's not possible. And the planter that I use, that I hired, probably costs $100,000, and even a little one costs $16,000 or something like that. So,
is this the no-till drill?
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Okay. Now I understand that Resource Conservation District here has one that you can rent.
You can rent it. It's more of a minimum till drill, so it won't do exactly what I was doing.
Okay. But that might work for some types of produce.
Yes.
Okay.
And certainly it's an excellent tool for planting cover crops.
Oh, good. Okay, that's true. Yeah, I know that's a dilemma for a lot of regenerative farmers is, you know, you don't want to till, so do you start with a lot of compost on top of somewhat depleted soil, or do you do a couple years of cover crops? You chose the option, I think, to do cover crops. Is that correct? Okay.
Right.
Yeah, because there are not, from what I understand, there aren't very many sources of mounds and mounds and mounds of compost in Nevada County. So.
No, if you want large amounts of compost, usually it comes from Yolo County, and it's a big truckload cost and so on. Probably not so practical.
Okay, so that would be, you might not be investing in equipment, but you're investing in the inputs that are required in order to do regenerative agriculture. Well, that's really interesting. So after 5 years, you'll tell us how this went.
You're right.
And you'll be making lots of money, right? So
and I hope the funding is still there. And,
that's right. Okay.
And I still have the land.
There you go. There you go. So where do we go from here? I mean, what sort of local measures can we do to support regenerative agriculture, or at least agriculture that's kinder to our soil, so we don't use up all the topsoil that we have? What do you recommend to folks?
Well, on the small farm side, I think encouraging people to experiment with regenerative ag and keeping that ground covered all the time and trying some no-till so that they figure out what will work in their particular situation. The larger scale for Nevada County is our rangeland. We have 106,000 plus acres of range and pasture land, most of which has had no improvement and has probably been largely overgrazed over the years, though there are some ranchers who are really conscientious about that. And the potential for carbon capture in those rangelands is huge if we could encourage ranchers to take up some of these processes and work with NRCS and the Resource Conservation District to help them with the funding on that.
Okay. Now, is this where the rangeland is subdivided into smaller paddocks, if you will, or areas, and you do mob grazing where cattle just don't wander all over as they please. You make them eat in one place and before they move to the next
yes,
place.
Certainly that's one of the processes is managed grazing, whether it's mob grazing or just not turning them loose and leaving them there all summer
Okay.
or all winter.
Yeah, because I know with my animals I try and do some, make them eat one place and they complain. This doesn't taste good. Let us over on the other side where the grass is greener, truly. Oh, so do you see anything in terms of zoning or anything of that nature that might be helpful in Nevada County? Do you think we're pretty well set up to do the grazing or the vegetable production? Are you hopeful in terms of the resources we have here?
I think we have enough land resources zoning-wise. The problem for starting farmers is they can't afford the land.
Okay.
And so programs like land resource basis that Sierra Harvest has and FarmLink offer connections between farmers and landowners who might be willing to let them use their land for cheap or for free or set up longer term arrangements. That's a major thing. But the other side of it is encouraging land that is zoned for agriculture or residential agriculture not to get rezoned to more dense housing, because that means more people, more land covered up, more vehicle trips, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's a concern I have too. I know we have a housing issue in Nevada County that needs to be resolved, but we certainly don't want it to be at the expense of some really great agriculture land. I still quote some of the history I've read that we used to export to Sacramento. They used to be a tremendously fertile area that was unrivaled. So we want to be sure that soil stays there. One last thing I wanted to get your comment on. In doing research for this, I see that the Rodale Institute, which is an old organic institute, I know you're familiar with them. I think they've been around 30 or 40 years.
Oh, longer than that.
Longer than that? Okay. They have a new certification that they're rolling out called the Regenerative Organic Certification, ROC. And it intrigues me because it has 3 pillars. It looks, of course, at plant health, what we've just been talking about, animal welfare, which we've got into a little bit in terms of grazing, but really going beyond that a little bit more in terms of how our animals are treated. And then a third pillar that you don't often see, and that's the one, social fairness for farmers. And that, what do you think about that? They're just, as I understand it, they're beginning to train people, and maybe by next year they will actually have this certification in place. Do you think that's promising? Do you think new farmers, or old farmers for that matter, will embrace a certification like this?
Well, consumers have to demand it, but I think it would be a tremendous addition to organic certification, because we know there are very large-scale organic farms who aren't necessarily following regenerative practices, and if they went over to such practices, it would make a big impact on climate change. So it also would make consumers aware of the impacts of agriculture and the impacts on agriculture. So I think it would be a great addition.
Okay, good. I'm good to hear those positive things. Well, I guess in closing, one of the things that you sort of give me a wonderful segue to this, in Nevada County we have a local food policy council, and they have just set a goal of 20% wholesome food by 2025, and that's defined as locally grown, nutritious food for local consumption. Right now, sadly, I think we have somewhere, depending on who you talk to, between 1 to 10% of our local produce is purchased and used by people here. So I hear you loud and clear in terms of a lot of this is up to consumers in terms of what they expect and what they want for the food that they put on their tables. So I want to thank you very much, Reed. This has been really interesting, fantastic. I appreciate all your research and all your knowledge in this area. And thank you all for watching. This is, again, if you'd like to see more programs like this, you can go to the Nevada County Digital Media website and you can pull down YouTube excerpts, or you could also go to Comcast Channel 17, where this program is aired on Monday nights at 7 p.m. And again, donations are always welcome if you want to continue to support programming like this. Thank you so very much for joining us.